Well, even in a perfect world, a hospital ICU is a tough enough environment. And today's reality is usually pretty bad, with alarms going off constantly, most of them false alarms. My guest today, Ophir Ronen, is a longtime entrepreneur, getting his start as co-founder of one of the first commercial internet backbones. His current company, CalmWave, is using AI to combat alarm fatigue in the ICU. And when he's not busy looking for the next big entrepreneurial thing, he's also a search and rescue volunteer. Hi, everyone. I'm David Williams, president of strategy consulting firm Health Business Group and host of the HealthBiz podcast, a weekly show where I interview top healthcare leaders about their lives and careers. If you enjoyed this episode, please press the like button and subscribe. Ophir, welcome to the HealthBiz podcast.
David, thanks so much for inviting me to speak on your podcast. We're really excited at the opportunity to make a difference in this space. The issue of alarm fatigue in ICUs has impacted clinicians, patients, and caregivers for decades, and the status quo is untenable. It's time for it to stop. So we're hoping to bring in everything that we learn from enterprise IT operations and what we've done there in remediating alarm fatigue, and do that in the ICUs as a first step.
That sounds great. I want to talk a little bit about your early career because it's fairly fascinating. And I'm interested in also just sort of like in your upbringing. Like, did you have like anything from your childhood that sort of stuck with you with your career and sort of how you got your start and how you went from there?
Yeah, absolutely. I would say sort of as a kid in grade school, I wasn't necessarily the best student. I found over my lifespan that I'm sort of an autodidact, right? Like I much prefer to learn on my own than in sort of a structured environment. And that can obviously cause conflicts in school, right? Where teachers are trying to teach everyone, what they're supposed to be teaching in the curriculum. And then you have kids that are, neurodiverse and want to learn other things. And so I think that for me, one of the things that was so helpful is, we've got our local libraries. I would be at the library every week. I had a librarian there. I think her name was Miss Williams, who basically showed me that I could learn anything that I wanted to. It was all out there. And so, we would go through my area of interest. She would like be opening up, hey, this was a good book and this was a good book. And I'd leave the library every week with a stack of like 10 to 15 books, carrying them like this.
Yeah.
And that was sort of the genesis for my really like intense interest in fostering that throughout my life. You can, especially nowadays, right? Like one of the promises of the internet fulfilled is that you can learn anything, right? It's all out there. So that's really exciting for me.
That's good. Well, I have empathy for the teachers who have to deal with a student like yourself, because on the one hand, if we didn't have your kind of student around here, we'd never have any new inventions or anything. But on the other hand, if we had everybody like you, they'd be killing themselves in school, and the teachers would be pulling their hair out if they if they hadn't already had it.
Absolutely.
So that's good. So then, what did you do? I know I read your bio, and you were talking about one of the first kind of commercial internet backbones. What was that all about? How'd that come about?
So, the advent of the commercial internet was in 1993, right? That was the transition for the academic network into the commercial network. And nobody really knew how to do that at the time, right? So you had these big like telecommunications backbones, and they had people that were connecting up via, dial-up modem at 14.4 baud, if anybody remembers that.
I think it was 300 back in my day. So
yeah, exactly. Teletype style.
Yeah.
But the internet backbones at the time, which were these telcos who were like, hey, TCP/IP sounds great, let's do it. They were interested in traffic within their network, right? So like, hey, host in my network and your customers who are also hosted will have great connectivity. And then they came up with the concept of network access points, because with the internet, you had the Internet Engineering Task Force, the IETF, and that was like a standards body that grew together, and you had all these like amazing engineers focused on how do we solve these problems of interconnectivity, of standardization, all these things. And it was a consensus-driven organization that put out what were called RFCs, right? Requests for comment, and everybody would weigh in, and it worked remarkably well. So the first step was, let's build network access points, which were facilities and data centers. All the telcos connect up, and that's how you transfer traffic between networks, right? So I'm connected over here. I want to get to this website over here on this other network. The problem is they didn't see any financial incentive to doing so. It was just like,
Yeah.
hey, you kind of got to do it. So very rapidly, these network access points got massively congested, and the internet was having trouble growing, right? Because
Right.
it was so bad between them. So with internet, what we did is we said, we think the problem is a meta problem rather than, hey, we just got to build bigger network access points. So what we did is we built a infrastructure where we built our own network access points and then connected to each of the 10 backbones in the same way at each one of these, because there's a protocol called BGP, or the border gateway protocol. That's what you use between large networks to transfer, hey, this is how you get to this is how you get to that. The problem with the BGP is you only have one direction of control. You can only control your outbound. So somebody could send back your data over a really crappy connection,
Yeah.
and then your overall experience would suck. So what we did at Internet is we built these facilities where every facility was connected to the same 10 backbones. And then we built early AI back then in like 1996, where each of the facilities would measure the connectivity between it and all the other facility across all the 10 backbones. And since we controlled both sides, at the time, and this is how far back this goes, right? So we had what we called the scrutinizers, and they were
Yeah.
watching all these connections. And then we had the cogitator in the middle, which was doing machine learning algorithms to figure out what is the best path from here to here across all these different networks. And you look at cost functions like, what's the price of this connection? What's the performance? Et cetera, et cetera. And then we had a piece called the actualizer, which created router configs and downloaded them to the big routers to change the whole mesh. So we were using a meta backbone on top of all of the existing backbones, which was pretty cool. It was
That
pretty
is
cool.
cool. I remember in those days there used to be these articles from time to time that say, like, is the internet gonna, like, is it gonna break? And it was
It did
before
break.
that, yeah, it was before that was like a metaphorical thing of some popular viral thing breaking the internet. But it was really, it's like, who's to say it's actually gonna, gonna work? So that, I
Right.
guess, the internaps of the world were making it happen. So
Absolutely. And the thing that for me was that really fostered my excitement about using big data, right? And
yeah,
like learning what you can accomplish. So, for me, like CalmWave is, a long road from there,
yeah,
all about what can we do with very large data sets, ideally novel data sets, right? Like
yeah,
those are the ones that are most exciting. So yeah, internet was a really good learning experience because we started with the five of us. It grew to 800. We
yeah,
learned how to build a network operations center. We wrote our own network management system. Like we learned everything,
yeah, yeah,
and
yeah.
it went public in 1999, and that was one of the biggest IPOs in Washington State, 16
Cool.
billion, which was real money back then.
Yeah, excellent. Yeah, there's some big companies in Washington State too, so that's
Absolutely.
that's something. So you had a couple others along the way. I know Planetary,
Yeah.
EEHQ, were others. What could you say about those before we get to CalmWave?
Yeah, so those were actually all companies focused on enterprise IT operations and
Yeah,
making it better for the people of
yeah,
operations, really. Planetary Fuels was it was a divergence in the sense that it was focused on biodiesel back at the point where everyone thought, hey, this is a great idea, using soybean oil because it's cheap, which
yeah,
then blew out the market eventually because everybody wanted to do it. And then we thought, hey, does it really make sense to use vegetable oil for
yeah,
fuel? That was a rhetorical question because
yeah,
it's no.
yeah,
But what we were doing at the time is we were intending to use Internet's model of distributed facilities. We
yeah,
had these 20-foot biodiesel reactors that we sourced out of, I think it was Croatia at the time,
yeah,
where you could do 2 million gallons a year of biodiesel. So these would be deployed. You start with one, and then you add two more, get up to 6 million gallons a year, and then you can deploy them at the farmer's field or at the point of distribution. So
yeah,
it was a nice model, but the economics didn't work out.
yeah, yeah, yeah. And how about EEHQ?
Yeah, so that I'm going to give you a quick definition of two important terms, right? The
Okay,
first term is what is an alert? So an alert is what goes out to the people to wake them up in the middle of the night to say, hey, you got to come online. There's a major incident going down. We got to fix it.
yeah,
An alarm is what is coming from the machines, right? So it's coming from the servers, the applications, the software services telling you something bad is happening. So there's a continuum of the alarms all the way to the alerts, right? So it's like something bad is happening, bring on the team to fix them. So at the time, PagerDuty was doing what I would characterize as guaranteed delivery alerting. So they were really, really good at making sure you would wake up the right people on the right teams
Yeah.
and then escalate all the way up to the CEO if needed. What EHQ was doing is we were focusing on the high frequency signals processing of these alarms coming from enterprise IT
Yeah.
that were for, from companies like and systems like IBM Tivoli, HP OpenView, a bunch of open source like Nagios, which is really noisy. And what we would do is we would pull in those alarms, normalize them into our common event format, what we called Ceph. And that was built based on work that IBM did way back when in the early 2000s. They had an autonomic computing initiative. So they were like
Yeah.
20 years ahead of their time.
Yeah. Yeah.
But one of the things that they did is they gave a bunch of statisticians like petabytes of log data and said, come up with a common event format. And as is sort of IBM's want, right? Like they came back with like 180 fields for one event. And we're like, no, that's too many. But there's great work here. And we ended up distilling that down to about 18 fields. And then we were able to map every alarm that we got from whatever system into those 18 fields.
Yeah.
So on the inside of EHQ, everything was really nicely structured data, which is what you need, right, in order to do what you want to do. So then we would take that data, we would suppress the noise, right? Because a lot of it is false positives.
Yeah.
Then we would group alarms into incidents because you can't have people looking at endless rows of
Right.
interleaved alarms coming in at high frequency and understand what's going on, especially when you're talking about like thousands of services all emitting these things. And then we would add in remediation information if we had it about, hey, we don't necessarily know what this is, but last time around you did this, this, and this. Here's some suggested, mechanisms to use. And then we would send it on to PagerDuty. And PagerDuty would send alerts to the right teams to get that, hey, here's an incident where everything is ready to go for you.
Got
So,
it.
it was kind of a nice setup, right, in terms of the synergy between the two companies. I sent an email to Alex Solomon, who is the uh, co-founder and former CEO of PagerDuty, and I said, Alex, what we're doing here together, going from alarms all the way to alerts, this is like peanut butter and jelly. Like,
Yeah.
why aren't we doing this together? Well, as it turns out, we did. And the reason why we did is that captured the entire workflow, right? From the alarms all the way to alerts.
Yeah.
By being in the middle, that was really exciting because now you have both the human centric data and the machine centric data all in one place.
Got it.
So my first job in joining PagerDuty, and I wanted to join PagerDuty because while EHQ was busily accumulating all this normalized data, PagerDuty had a 10-year advance on us. And
Yeah.
for me, again, like I mentioned, I love, novel data sets. So in joining PagerDuty, the first thing that I got to do was to move our rate of ingestion and bring in EHQ's technologies and scale them up to PagerDuty size. So I was talking to the team and they were very, very conservative at the time, like
Yeah.
one deployment a quarter kind of stuff.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
stability is what it's all about. And I'm like, we gotta move. So, the goal was we got to move from one event per second per service to a
Hmm.
thousand events per second per service because we want it all.
Yeah.
What looks like a false positive is still an indication that something's going on, right? So you
Yeah.
want that for trending and analysis. So I was called the bulldozer, not in the nicest ways,
No.
but we got it done. It was truly like replacing the engines on a 747 in flight, like a lot of internal outages in doing that because you're
Yeah.
doing mass. I mean, we used to call that forklift upgrades back in the network
Uh-huh.
space, right?
Okay.
You got to put in all this new stuff. And then I got the opportunity once we did that to build something out of this data set, right? Really interesting data set. And what I ended up doing, I pulled in a team of just phenomenal folks who I'm honored to say are also part of CalmWave. Big data engineers, phenomenal world-class data scientists, UX architects, wonderful people. And what we did is we built what we called operations health. And operations health is or was in the enterprise IT space the ability to understand the impact that being in operations is having on the people of operations. So we would build an operations health score that was a composite score, right? Everybody understands 0 to 100, but the
Yeah.
parameters of that score were things like we would break up each day into 4 buckets. You have like work, which you don't really care about alerts during
Yeah.
work. Then you had dinner time, then you had evening time, and then you had nighttime. And then we would bias those because nighttime awakenings, especially for false positives, have the greatest degradation of operations
Yeah.
health. They're waking up people's families, right? It's not just you. the phone by your bedside is going off. Your wife's being awoken. You have to get up. It's really bad. And then we measure, is this happening day after day, consecutively? Is it happening on weekends, holidays? And then we distill that all down into those scores between 0 and 100 for every person, every team, and then every service. So we could see where that pain is coming from. And then we would go to folks like, C-levels at IBM and Oracle and others and say, hey, you know what? These 10 services, software services of your thousands, are causing the greatest operations
Yeah.
pain to these teams. And here are the people on those teams that if you don't do anything about this, statistically speaking, are going to leave your organization in 1 to 2 quarters, right? And it's much more expensive to find new senior DevOps engineers than it is to retain your great ones, right?
Yeah.
So then we would go through an engagement where we would help them and say, let's pick some KPIs together, and then we'll give you recommendations week over week to get your operations health better. And we knew that if they followed our recommendations, it would work, right? Because we designed the system. But the way that we really knew it would work, and it took us a good 11, 12 iterations of the algorithm, right? Because it's a science and it's an art form. Because once you
Yeah.
have the right parameters, you also have to figure out what's the weighting, what's most important here in terms of the impact. So it took us 11 or 12 iterations to get to the point where people would look at their last week of operations health scores and say, you nailed it. This is my Tuesday was so bad. And, so on and so forth. So the ultimate sort of measure of the success of that were that team members would go back to their manager after we did those engagements and say, you know what, my last on call was better than it's ever been. Thank you.
Yeah.
So that was really
Great.
powerful.
All right. That's gratifying if you can get to that.
Absolutely.
So let's talk about CalmWave.
Sure.
Where did this idea come from? I get
Yeah.
some clue to it, but what's the, why this application?
Yeah, so it actually came in a sort of organic fashion. So after I left PagerDuty, we bought some property up in the mountains. This was kind of like right as COVID was beginning. So
Yeah.
maybe it wasn't the best time to go on sabbatical, but it turned out for me it was fantastic. So, this property was really, really overgrown, like 50 years of like
Yeah.
just not really neglect, but not doing what you need to do. And, when you don't have the periodic forest fires that happened 8 to 10 years back in the
Right.
day, all of that undergrowth just keeps growing and growing and growing. And it had gotten to the point where like you had to bushwhack anywhere on the property. It was like that dense.
Yeah.
So I spent about a year and a half on my tractor and excavator. And I might say I learned how to drive an excavator on
Good.
YouTube. On YouTube.
Nice.
And it also turns out that once, I started on smaller ones, but you can order a 15-ton excavator to be delivered to your house. It comes on a semi. Here's the key. Go. And I was
Yeah.
like, yeah. So it was awesome. But as part of that, I also joined search and rescue as a way of, giving back to the community.
Yeah.
And there's phenomenal people in search and rescue just by, the very nature of the mission. And it also included lots of clinicians. And when you're going down the trail towards a rescue, you got time to talk, right? Just like when you go hiking, there's time to talk. And that's when I first started hearing about clinical alarm fatigue. And I was intrigued because I know a lot about alarms and I know a
Yeah.
lot about alarm fatigue and more importantly, remediating alarm fatigue.
Yeah.
So as is sort of my want, I started reading the literature, right? Like what's out there. Turns out there's a lot out there. There's like over 500 papers written about alarm
Yeah.
fatigue and the impact on clinicians, patients, their caregivers. And the thing that was sort of most heartening is that I also found references to senior nurses who had done projects to work on this and had solved it in a manual fashion. But the
Yeah.
problem is, without a platform that is continually adjusting thresholds, especially for newly admitted patients that are diverging from those kind of hard limits that they had set, entropy sets back in, and that's why the status quo continues. So with that in mind, I was like, okay, this is something here. We can do this because I think that pattern that we developed in enterprise IT maps pretty well
Yeah.
here.
Yeah.
And so then I thought, okay, well, where do I start this, right? I'm coming from enterprise IT. I got a wealth of contacts there. I know a lot of people, but effectively none in healthcare.
Yeah.
So I thought to myself, okay, I need to find an incubator that would be a good fit and have that wealth of contacts that I needed for customer validation and all of that to bootstrap. And that's when I found the Allen Institute for Artificial Intelligence here in Seattle. So that's Paul Allen, the former,
Yeah.
Microsoft co-founder, and he has funded the institute in perpetuity. right, from his estate. The thing that's so amazing about the institute is it's a world-class AI institute, phenomenal data engineers, data scientists. The ethos is AI for the common good, and that aligns perfectly with what I believe, right? AI is to augment us, right, to make us be able to do even greater things. And then secondly, their last like five companies were healthcare companies. So I was like, okay, that's a good fit. And it's in
Yeah.
Seattle, which is nice. And so I applied. We got a response in 2 days saying this is very interesting. Let's dig in, and we were accepted shortly thereafter. And I'm thrilled to say that we are the fastest company to ever go through the incubator. So we went from inception, customer validation, to our seed funding in 5 months, which is just an
Great.
indication of how bad this problem is and how
Yeah.
excited people are to solve it.
So, I've heard alarm fatigue, alert fatigue. I've never really heard a distinction between alarms and alerts. Now, let me see if I've understood right what you were
Yeah.
saying. So if I'm think about it from any kind of equipment, but let's say a piece of hospital equipment, something that an alarm is going to go off because something's out of balance. There's something that has happened that's out of the band for the machine notices something's happened.
Yeah.
Now, once that happens, now I need to interpret it. And it's an indicator, assume the machine's working, it's an indicator of some kind of an incident. If
Yeah.
you can understand the pattern that's going on there, then you can understand how it could be remediated or how it's been remediated in the past. Once you do that,
That's right.
then that tells you whether to alert someone, who to alert, and when, how urgent it is, depending
That's right.
on where it is. And that's how you go from alarm to alert. So maybe one of the root causes that is that if it's an unmanaged situation, every alarm turns into an alert for whoever happens to be
You
around.
nailed it, David. You nailed it. That's the problem, right? Like we're bringing in sort of a newer concept, right? Based on sort of what is the status quo in enterprise IT. Like for us, you don't get alerted to individual alarms, right? I
Yeah,
mean, in the context of enterprise IT, at times we were working with hundreds of alarms per second. Can you get hundreds of alarms per
yeah,
second on your phone or your pager? No, you can't. It's horrible.
yeah,
So that's another concept that we're bringing in, right? Like the idea is, okay, well, we want to pull in all these vital signs,
yeah,
whether they look like they're false positive or not, because that's very interesting in terms of trending, analysis, and everything
yeah.
else. And we're also intelligently grouping alarms into incidents. And an
Right.
incident is a container of context. People work on incidents, people don't work on alarms, right? So you alert someone to an incident which has all of the alarms already in it. And that's how it's supposed to work. That's
Got
a
it.
way more efficient path.
Got it. So is the problem in the ICU is that there is an alarm that goes off every minute, and if they're going out 5,000 a second, then they just wouldn't bother with it. I mean, what's the why all these alarms? Why have we
Yeah.
allowed the hospital system to get to this spot?
Yeah. Yeah. It's a great question. So this is something that's been happening for a long time, right? In decades, really.
Yeah,
The issue is that it's getting worse and worse. And the reason why it's getting worse and worse is that, the device manufacturers have tried to fix this problem for a long time. The
yeah,
problem is they're very device centric, right? They're focusing on the latest version of the firmware that we're going to deploy to, these devices, absolutely going to fix the problem. But it's not an individual device problem, right? It's a holistic problem where you pull in all of the signals regardless of the vendor to understand what's going on. As an example of that, you can get an alarm which is loud saying this patient doesn't have blood pressure, right?
yeah,
The blood pressure is 20, and that's an alert and it's beeping and all that. But if you have the ability to look at all the other vital signs, you can say, you know what? It's clear that the cuff is tied to the bed, not to the person. Why are you
yeah,
alarming like this? Because everything else is fine, right? So the reason why it hasn't really been solved, in my estimation, is industry has placed the clinicians in a untenable situation. And here's what I mean, right? What they have done is they've set the high and low thresholds, right? Like what I mean by that is like you look at a vital signs like heart rate,
yeah,
right? If someone has a heart rate lower than 40, that might be a big deal. If
yeah.
they have a heart rate larger than 100 or faster than 120, that might also be a big deal.
Mm-hmm.
Problem is, not everyone's the same, right?
Yeah,
Even your age can make a huge difference, right? A pediatric vital sign,
yeah,
the normal there is very different than a geriatric or an adult, right? So when you have here's your defaults and that's what's set in conjunction with really hard UXs, right? Like these
yeah,
UXs, they're like 1980s, man. It's
yeah,
like push this button, go to this screen, push this
yeah,
button, go to this screen. So at times, nurses need to bring in hospital techs in order to set these thresholds. On top of that, you look at the importance of what those thresholds mean, right? That's how you're going to be alerted, right, to something bad happening. Nurses being asked to do that without any context of why
Yeah.
they should be doing that is ludicrous, right? Like they don't want to be on the hook if someone dies because of a missed alarm because they
No.
made changes based on their intuition. So that's why I mean by like it's an untenable situation for them. It's not okay, right? They've been past all the risk. Yeah, we told you, we told you, we told you, but it's well beyond the bounds of human comprehension. It's
Yeah.
just noise, right? And so that is the genesis, that's the core of the issue,
Got
right?
it.
Like,
Got it.
yeah.
So what do you do about it, and how is it different, let's say, in an ICU setting compared with in a more of like a, systems operation, like outside of the medical context, like you might have been dealing with, IBM and all the parameters and that kind of thing?
Yeah, I would say the biggest difference right now is, well, I'm going to go to the similarities first. It's
Yeah.
very, very similar, right? Like they're all signals. They're
Yeah.
all signals. They're all generating alarms. They all have false positives. They all have false negatives, right? So for us, it's exciting because, like I said, I have the same team that we've worked
Yeah.
together for years. We're looking at these, the signals analysis. And, our data scientists come out of like the aerospace world, right? They come from like Boeing R&D. So they're used to looking at data, really just first exploring the data. What does it mean?
Yeah.
It's not like, hey, we're signing up for, folks who understand the latest Amazon, machine learning pipeline, whatever. These are
Yeah.
like data scientists where the way that I've been able to work with these fantastic folks is I'm like, hey, look at this data. It's so cool. Let's dig into it.
Yeah.
And so that's what they're doing. They're using the same methodology as before, which is look at all this really cool operations data. What can we do with it? We're now taking that and now we're looking at the signals processing of this data. So for us, one of the things that really like pushed CalmWave forward is we got access to 46,000 patients worth of data spanning 11 years and then started really digging into that and seeing how vital signs interrupt together and
Yeah.
coming up with the appropriate thresholds. So for us, appropriate thresholds, the way that we engage is that it's typically a chief nursing officer is our champion, right? Because in a lot
Hmm.
of ways, if you think about it, healthcare is like an enterprise sales with much longer timeline. You
Yeah.
still need your champion, you still need your stakeholders, all that. So for us, in our context, it's the chief nursing officer, and the focus in terms of the model is on ROI. Because if you save one nurse from leaving as an FTE nurse, which you're paying probably 100 to 120K. That's a separate conversation,
Yeah.
right? They should be paid a lot more than that for what they do. But if they leave because their environment is so bad that they have to leave and do something else, typically they go to a contractor nurse. And that's because the pay is much higher, right?
Yeah.
So if a nurse leaves because of, alarm fatigue, all these other things, a hospital will pay 3 to 5x to a contracting company in
Yeah.
order to get a replacement nurse. So it's if we can save one nurse from leaving, just like we did in enterprise IT space, well, now you've accrued 2x ROI on that. So that's sort of the financial model to it, but it all
Yeah.
starts with first getting in. So we talk to the CNO and we say, which of your ICUs do you want to start with? It's probably not a COVID ICU where you got people in the hallways and that
Yeah.
kind of thing. More than likely, it's a surgical ICU, a med ICU. And what we ask for is a year's worth of data. And we
Hmm.
say, okay, the reason why we need a year's worth of data is because not only is it every set of threshold population specific, right? That's very important. But we also want to capture the seasonality because people are sicker in the winter versus the
Yeah.
summer and so on. Once we have that, we push it through our CalmWave optimized algorithms. And those algorithms, if you look at the criteria, and let me know if I'm going too deep.
No, it's good.
If you look at the criteria, there's three primary criteria for us. One, zero false negatives. So we're inherently
Yeah.
more conservative than what we see out there. Number two, minimizing false positives. And then number three, minimizing the number of threshold changes that a nurse does to greatest effect, right? Because right
Yeah.
now it's all manual, right? The nurses are our remote hands because there's no APIs for this and never has been. So if CalmWave is one measure of extreme success for CalmWave is that hospitals force the device manufacturers to build APIs to threshold changes, which can happen based on, really clear definition of what's happening here. That's
Yeah.
another thing. That's another thing, right? Like AI in healthcare must be explainable, right?
Yes.
So for us, we give them not only the why we suggest these changes, showing them the timeline, the data, We also provide the how, where we reach into the manual and show them right in the interface, hey, here are the steps that you should take, right? It's like this, and away you go. So that's the setup. And then we do an 8-week engagement, may sound familiar, where we set
Yeah.
KPIs like let's reduce alarms by 25%, let's improve operations, and so on and so forth. And then week over week, we start by saying, okay, week 2, right? We've got our KPIs. Here is your noisiest vital sign signal. We don't care where it's coming from. This is your noisiest one. It's causing the
Yeah.
most, alarms. And here's the recommended high and low threshold settings based on that year's worth of data. Go implement that. And then next week at the same time, we come back and we say, hey, this is the impact to the KPIs based on your last action. Here's the next loudest, right? So it's like a step function reduction leading to a quiet ICU. And then as soon as we're done with that, and now you have a quiet ICU, the first one in a hospital, any new patients that is admitted to that ICU, as soon as we have at least 2 hours worth of data and assuming that they're diverging from those CalmWave
Yeah.
optimized thresholds, we, because of physiology, condition, or otherwise, will generate a new set of CWO thresholds tuned to that patient. And that's how you keep the entropy from setting back in,
Got
right?
it.
You set appropriate defaults and then you start tracking all the new patients.
So how well understood is the connection between sort of alarm fatigue or alert fatigue and the nurse burnout or departure rate? Is it something, I mean, clearly you could say, if it saves one, it's worth some multiple of what you're
Yeah,
charging, but
yeah,
is the relationship actually understood?
yeah.
How, yeah,
Yeah, that's actually a great question. When you look at like, burnout studies, you see a lot of things in there. Alarm fatigue is in there, but it's not the biggest thing because, and this is
yeah,
what's so sad, alarm fatigue and the status quo is seen as that's your lot in
just
life,
how it is.
right?
Yeah,
Just how it is.
yeah,
And if you think about how it dramatically impacts anyone who comes into the ICU. So I'm sad to say I have a personal story about that. So my father-in-law, who I've known for 32 years and love, passed away last year. So he got diagnosed, super healthy, got diagnosed with stage 4 lung cancer
mm,
in May, passed away in September. So he was in the ICUs on and off for four
yeah,
months. And I have a voice memo from him that I'll keep forever, which is like, Ophir, I'm trying to recover from bowel surgery. The only thing I want to do is sleep. And every few minutes, something is blaring in my ear next
yeah,
to my bedside, and nobody's coming to do anything about it.
yeah,
And
yeah,
that's the status quo. So it's this really corrosive thing that's happening, but because that's the way it is,
right.
I think it's going to take someone like us coming from the outside in, where we've solved this problem over here in this adjacent space.
Yeah,
Now
yeah,
we're coming in to do the same here to really solve this problem. Because in many cases, people view alarms as this junkyard of noise, and
right.
we're looking at it and we're like, wow, look at all this
Yeah,
data. We can do so much with this.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
So that's why coming into the ICUs and remediating alarm fatigue, that's our wedge into all the data because we want vital signs data, we want intervention data, we want labs, we want notes, we want it
Yeah, yeah.
all. But this is the way that we get there is by solving this big, hairy problem.
No, it sounds reasonable. So you'll be able to go after the sort of the relationship between the workforce and the alarms, and then maybe different from the enterprise IT side as you've got, as you were referring with your father-in-law. I'm sorry to hear about his story.
Thanks. Yeah,
Um, but it's also that there could be an impact on patient care too, right? And it's partly
absolutely.
partly that, just somebody, if they can't sleep, they're not going to get better and recover, and it's going to be
That's
that
right.
in and itself is a trauma.
That's
But
right.
also that, if the alerts are to alert the nurse to do something clinical with the patient, and if you've get rid of the noise and just have the signal, then
Yeah.
they also get signaled what to do, and more likely it could happen, and the patient could benefit from that as well.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. And there's a couple of really interesting things within that. Like if I unpack it a little bit, like for us, like I mentioned, like remediating alarm fatigue, that's the wedge, right? But
Yeah,
as a result of pulling in that data, then we can build operations health scores in the
yeah,
context of hospitals, which is the first objective measure of clinician workload. And we do that for every nurse, every unit, and every hospital, and then benchmark hospitals against each other
yeah,
in like size and revenue. So now, as a C-level exec and as a board, you have our actual algorithmic understanding of how your hospital is doing. So, right. So it starts with operations efficiency and
yeah,
orchestration, but then ultimately the next step, even beyond that, as we're building out patient acuity scores, predictions, and so on, right? There's like all these layers of value once you've got that data. Ultimately, we want to go all the way down the path of measuring hospital operations maturity across multiple axes and then benchmarking the world,
Yeah,
which
yeah.
I think will be hugely beneficial.
Great. So I want to close out. I want to go back a little bit to where we started and what it was like being a kid that was not, a good student, so to speak. And I wonder, given your, and some people have the experience you have, right, with Mrs. Williams or whoever it was in the
Yeah,
library
yeah,
and support and you go on to do, great things. And some people actually don't have that experience. They don't fit in school and they end up on a track that isn't as good. What
right.
would you have advice for, let's say, parents of students who might have been like yourself as a kid, and how to help them get more on your track and less on another one?
It's I'm sure everyone has heard this before, but it's actually true. You got to foster a lifelong love of learning, right? It's like, hey, even if you don't work well in a structured learning environment, it's out there, right? And you're gonna fail. But every time you do, you learn, right? So, from my perspective, I've had a number of successful outcomes, right? Three great outcomes. CalmWave's my sixth startup. The rest of them all failed.
Yeah,
That's okay because you learn so much each time. So that needs to apply across, everything in life, really, right? Failing is learning. You just
yeah.
got to get better. And so, yeah, lifelong learning is what's key, I think.
So last question, if you have any good books that you've read lately, anything that you would recommend?
Yeah, so I'm sort of all over the place. My
Yeah,
my latest good book that I would say is The Hard Thing About Hard Things by Ben Horowitz.
yeah,
And he does a really good overview of a company that he built and all the challenges and
yeah.
again what you learn from all these failings, like really really great description and analysis. And yeah, if you're interested in startups, that's a great book to get a
So
framework
that
on.
is the most recommended book on the HealthBiz podcast. So I finally did read it
Good.
actually probably a year ago. So I have
Yeah,
I've seen it. It'll be familiar to our audience.
yeah.
Well, I really appreciate hearing your story. I want
Likewise,
to
David.
say, Ophir, thank you so much for joining me today on the
My
HealthBiz
pleasure.
podcast.
Thanks so much, David.
You've been listening to the HealthBiz podcast with me, David Williams, president of Health Business Group. I conduct in-depth interviews with leaders in healthcare business and policy. If you like what you hear, go ahead and subscribe on your favorite service. While you're at it, go ahead and subscribe on your second and third favorite services as well. There's more good stuff to come, and you won't want to miss an episode. If your organization is seeking strategy consulting services in healthcare, check out our website, healthbusinessgroup.com.